Thank you so much for tuning into this webinar. And this webinar tonight is focused on board leadership and management. Over the next hour, we're going to discuss 3 areas of board leadership and management. First, we're going to touch on organizational structure of nonprofit sport organizations. And then we're going to move specifically into board governance. And we will conclude by focusing on a board's responsibilities. We're speaking mostly to nonprofits this evening through this webinar, but I'm aware that there are for-profit organizations here, and there are lots of principles in this presentation that relate. Although there are different legal requirements, I'm not going to speak to those necessarily, but I'm sure that BC Soccer can help you if you have further questions, or I can attempt to answer those at the end of the presentation. So my name is, as Gabe said, is Lara Schroeder. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm based in Saskatoon, which is located on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. My academic and professional background is in sport management, where I have a Master's of Arts in Recreation and Leisure Studies focused on sport governance from the University of Waterloo. I spent several years working at Saskatchewan Soccer before I started my own business, which is Spark Solutions. And I support sport and recreation organizations to achieve their organizational goals in governance, strategy, and programming. And over the past 1.5 years, I've worked with local, provincial, regional, and national sport organizations. I'm also very enthusiastic about volunteering. I'm a trained volleyball coach and referee, and I have volunteered at a variety of levels, including internationally, which was in Austria, Russia, and Norway. As you can see here, I'm at the Lillehammer Games in 2016, and this is at Biathlon, where I was very excited to see that live. So let's first get acquainted with the organizational structure of a nonprofit. So with the nonprofit organization specifically, according to the Government of Canada, a nonprofit here is defined as an association, club, or society that is not a charity and is organized and operated exclusively for social welfare, civic improvement, pleasure, recreation, or any other purpose except for profit. They provide programs and services to members, clients, or beneficiaries. Nonprofit organizations are governed by a volunteer board of directors, and if they are incorporated, which generally larger organizations are, they are guided by provincial and federal legislation. And actually, even if you're not incorporated, you are expected to maintain those principles as well. The board of directors that governs a nonprofit is a legal entity with the ultimate responsibility for all affairs of the organization. Under the law, the board is a single unit, and while it's comprised of individuals, it must ultimately act and speak with one voice. Directors are members of the board, whereas officers are directors who have been tasked with specific duties, such as a chair or a president, a vice chair / vice president, or a secretary or treasurer. There are other kinds, but those are the most common. The board should be of a size that facilitates a board culture of engagement, personal responsibility, cooperation, and efficient decision-making. The Canada Soccer Club Licensing Programs Manual recommends 8 to 12 directors, and that is a criteria if you reach some of the higher levels of that program. I've seen organizations with more members on their board, and they often do this to distribute the work across people and hopefully not overload that small subset of people. But we'll discuss in a moment that 8 to 12 is an optimal number to remain flexible and responsive. It's very tough to steer the ship the larger the ship is. The board is elected by an annual election process, and that process is used to elect the board is generally outlined in the bylaws and governance policies of the organization, as well as government legislation. Standing committees are ongoing permanent committees that are authorized to do the work of the board. They do not have greater authority than that of the board, which means that they cannot make decisions beyond their scope, and their decisions must ultimately be approved by the board. To do this, committees should provide regular reports to the board, and in those reports, they should provide their recommendations based off of their research, their knowledge, and their expertise. The board would then review those recommendations, generally trust those recommendations to be solid recommendations based on that research, knowledge, and expertise, and approve them, so then the committee may do its work. The more common standing committees include governance, audit and finance, risk management, nominations, and human resources. Ad hoc committees, which are also sometimes called task forces, are formed from time to time and are focused on a specific mandate. So ad hoc examples of ad hoc committees might include strategic planning or capital fundraising, development of a facility, or committees formed to develop or manage a specific project. These standing and ad hoc committees are the responsibility of the board and are strategic in nature, and they differ from operational committees, which deal with the program and operational matters, and they are accountable to staff or management. Common operational committees might include technical committee, program committees, awards committees, equipment, facilities, fundraising committees on a regular basis, all sorts of ongoing committees I've seen in the soccer space. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have seen some organizations with very large boards of 14 to 20 people, and many of those people are doing operational work. Utilizing committees can be advantageous because it allows you to bring in more people, which means less work for each person. And you can bring individuals with specialized skill sets to do that work, and it can feed your volunteer pipeline and support succession on your board. So for instance, one organization I worked with last summer, they had a board of 15 to 20 people, and they had a technical director for female programming, a technical director for male programming. They had a grassroots technical director. And I said to them, great, awesome, you have these people involved, but could they actually just form a technical committee and you have one of those people who reports to your board? So this is the type of thing I'm describing here. But for committees to be effective, they must have well-written policies or terms of reference. There is additional work with recruiting people to those committees, as well as training and managing those people. And it can be challenging to ensure that the board is effectively overseeing the committees and that individual agendas aren't driving the committee's work. Smaller organizations may operate without any staff, and in this case, these organizations might have an executive committee. This executive committee executes the strategy mandated by the board and manages the operations and programming of the organization. This would include overseeing the design and implementation of all programs, reporting to the board, managing staff, implementing and adhering to policy, financial management, development and management of partnerships, promotions and marketing, management of member relations, and sponsorship, grants, and fundraising. So in essence, everything. This would allow the board to remain strategic and not mix in with operations as much as they might have to, otherwise if there was no executive committee. And I will be honest, I haven't seen an executive committee in my work, but I'm sure they do exist. And I pulled that information from Canada Soccer's reference from the club licensing program. There's more information there as well, if that is something that interests you. If organizations are larger or do not have executive committees, they likely employ staff. The board typically has one employee. That's the executive director, or that could be the CEO. Sometimes it's an administrator. The board hires and manages the ED, and then the ED executes the operational work based off of the board's strategic direction. The executive director may then, based off of budget and the scope of the organization, hire employees. In some of the larger organizations in the country, that definitely is the case. The ED, the employees that the executive director hires then are employees not of the board, but of the executive director. The board only has one employee, that's the executive director, and then that could be within their mandate to hire more staff. The executive director is governed by policies which are called executive limitations. They tell the executive director what they may not do. They are written in such a way that they state everything in the negative, as in the executive director may not spend a sum of money more than $5,000 without the board's approval, which means that the board, the executive director may spend up to $5,000 without the board's approval. Anything that's not written is fair game to the executive director. So you do want to be specific and ensure that your executive limitations cover everything that you need it to cover. In many nonprofit organizations, volunteers often execute the work of the organization, and in many cases, they are the only human capacity of the club or organization. It's optimal if organizations have role descriptions for each type of volunteer they use that detail the specific roles and duties, as well as the time required, who oversees them, what training they receive, really any information you might need to share with that volunteer about that position. And it's important to manage the volunteer life cycle, meaning from when the volunteer is recruited to if someone, they should review their application, review their documents, if they have a police record check with vulnerable sector, if they have references, those types of things, when they're accepted into the organization. So that includes the onboarding and the training, the ongoing supervising of those volunteers, the reviewing of them. Perhaps you provide ongoing or regular annual, perhaps, meetings with them to review what they've done and provide any feedback that you have, as well as releasing them from the organization, which is not an often talked about subject. Of course, individual directors of the board are volunteers. Board directors are expected to act in good faith, meaning they do their best for the organization. To do this, individual directors should be prepared for meetings by reading on the information they're provided, be informed, pay attention to the website, what information is being released there, check their emails regularly, respond to those emails regularly, what have you, as well as they must be willing to roll up their sleeves and get the job done. They must be the benchmark. And to me, this means if your organization has a code of conduct, your board members should be upholding that code of conduct to the highest degree. If your organization has organizational values as part of its strategic plan, your board should be leading those values and executing those to the best of their ability, so that you are leading from out front and you are showing your membership what you are expecting that they will do. That definitely sets the tone of the organization. Individuals should make every attempt to minimize conflict of interest, and they should maintain confidentiality. And so we'll talk a little bit more about conflict of interest in a little bit here. Okay, so we've talked about the structure of a nonprofit organization. So now let's speak more specifically about the board's governance. Legally, the board has fiduciary responsibilities, which mean they hold a legal and ethical relationship of trust with the public and with their membership. So they're tasked to steward the organization on the membership's or public's behalf. These three legal duties, so duty of loyalty, duty of obedience, and duty of care, describe how the board must do their work, and boards must do everything in their power to uphold these three duties. So I will describe these now. The first is the duty of loyalty. The duty of loyalty requires that a director, in making decisions, acts with a view to the best interests of the organization, must minimize conflicts of interest within the board and with other organizations. Well-performing boards, apologies if you can hear my cat having a heyday in the background. Well-performing organization boards will ensure that directors do not have dual loyalties arising from their membership on another board. So what this might mean is if you are on the board of your local club, you should also not be on the board of your district. Or if you're on the board of your district, you should not also be on the board of BC Soccer, so on. Next is duty of obedience. This requires obeying applicable laws and regulations, but also being obedient to or fulfilling the stated mission of the organization. What this might mean is if you are a youth organization, you serve only youth, you can't just turn around and start serving adults. In order to do that, there must be a series of things that happen in order to change that, because your duty of obedience is to your membership, which is currently your youth. That's not to say you can't change, but you can't just do that willy-nilly. The third is duty of care. This means that you must be a careful and diligent and apply skill that can be reasonably expected of a person performing their functions as a director. And if ever a board was taken to court, that would be the expectation that they would consider. Would a reasonable person have done the same thing? Board directors have to pay attention, read board materials, and ask probing questions in order to fulfill their duty of care. It's not simply open the email, scan the email, and close the email, or the financial statement, whatever that may be. It's opening it up, digging in, making sure that you would sign off on it if it was your own personal financial statement. Board members are privy to certain discussions and information that must remain confidential needs to, and that information should not be discussed with anyone else. Now, how the board functions and does the work of the organization lives on a spectrum. On one end, we have operational boards. Operational boards make the everyday decisions and do the work of the organization, including developing and managing the budget. I've seen many local sport organizations and clubs that are operational, but there are also provincial sport organizations out there that are fully volunteer. There aren't, as far as I know of, any national sports, but there are some who do operate with operational boards with one staff. On the other side of the spectrum is the Policy Governance Board, which sets the strategy and direction, hires and manages the executive director or CEO, and then approves their operational and spending plans. Often, sport boards and other nonprofits live somewhere in the middle between operational and strategic. And that can work as long as you have policies that adequately supports those things. I currently sit on a board, and in 2020, our executive director left and we were without an executive director for about 6 or 7 months. We were required to do the operational activities to keep the lights on. So that included paying bills and writing checks, that sort of thing. When we hired our replacement, we had to move back into the governance role, which is where we normally fully live, and give up those reins and make sure that we were separating that. So we went back to overseeing policy and overseeing our executive director as they execute our strategy. It is considered best practice for nonprofit organizations to live on the policy governance end of the spectrum. And to do this, boards set the direction and the organizational framework, such as the policies. Oversight through policy development involves the creation of a whole host of policy documents and processes that might be just a few very robust, straightforward policies that might be a very extensive policy manual. They also create executive limitations that define and limit the scope of management's authority, the executive director's authority. So as a matter of fact, the board that I sit on, we recently hired a consultant to help us review our executive limitations. We started with 8 executive limitations, and after that review, we've now jumped to 18. So time has passed. Things are definitely different, and we've more than doubled our executive limitations. So we have some new things that relate to social media, which is not that new. We're a little bit behind, but that covers a whole breadth of things. That also includes developing policy like the code of conduct, which might be developed in consultation with your executive director, but ultimately that's the board's to approve. Whistleblower policies in case something is on the funky side. Formal processes to assess the performance of the senior management, the executive director. Operational succession planning. So what happens if your executive director leaves? What plans do you have in place for that? Regularized management updates, financial reporting requirements, and reports on program and service quality. And most importantly, ongoing measurement of progress on meeting the priorities of the strategic plan. Policy governance boards may recruit specific individuals with specific knowledge and skill sets to do this. And that includes lawyers or accountants, for instance, to provide specific expertise in legal or financial matters. So I've listed 3 here: the Carver governance model, the relationship model, and the hybrid model. There's different models. Those are some of the most common. Almost everyone's heard of the Carver governance model. And there's hybrids. You can blend the two or more, I suppose. This speaks to how the policy is set up, the sorts of policies you have, and how you monitor and review them. So if you're panicking, your organization doesn't follow a model specifically, I'm not saying you have to, but it might be something that is helpful for you and provides a framework. We've spoken now about board governance at a high level, so let's get into some of the specific responsibilities of the board. First and foremost, the board must set the direction of the organization. This includes the guiding statements of the organization, which is the vision, the mission, and the values. It must consider what it wants, as in the board must consider what it wants the organization to be in the short term, in the day-to-day, in the midterm, 3 to 5 years, and in the long-term sense, 5 to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. We often are usually so busy running our sport in the day-to-day, season to season, year to year, that we don't think big or long-term down the road. And I would say that that's not just a soccer thing. That is definitely a sport thing, I think, and perhaps a nonprofit thing. We're just focused on keeping the lights on, keeping things going. But every once in a while, we should stop and make a concentrated amount of time and focus to discuss what we envision our organization to be in 50 years. What do we picture for ourselves? Do we picture having a facility? Do we picture offering cradle to grave programming for everyone? Do we picture being the largest club in the community? What do we envision for ourselves? The board then would take that, think about that in a long-term sense, and would develop a short and midterm objectives by creating a strategic plan. Strategic plans are normally 4 years that align with national funding, but they can be shorter than that. I've seen 3 and 2 years. I've also seen up to 6 to 8 years. So it's what your organization is comfortable with. The board would define the short and midterm goals in that plan, and then it gets turned to your executive director or executive committee and your staff to decide how they are going to execute this plan. The board then needs to monitor the implementation of this plan to ensure it's heading in the direction that the board envisioned with this strategic plan. Often we write these plans, they sit on the shelf, and then in 4 years, we're like, okay, well, that went well, but we don't actually know if we did it. So I would suggest to you that it should be a document you refer to regularly and really look at as to whether you're delivering those objectives. The second thing the board needs to do is to communicate the direction of the organization. The board sets the culture and the tone of the organization, and the board can change that culture and that tone through both intentional and unintentional actions. The board communicates that direction through the strategic plan, through its governing documents and policies, through its staff, and through its actions and words. Earlier, I mentioned that the board should be the benchmark of the organization. For instance, if your organization has a value of inclusivity, then you as the board should be saying hello, how are you, to everyone you come across in your interactions with the board. If you are saying that you have a value of inclusivity, you should be working very hard to recruit diverse individuals to sit on your board and your committees and perhaps your staff. So, and I think that goes in other ways as well. If you say that you are welcoming, then what are you as a board doing to demonstrate that you are welcoming? It's not just a staff thing. It's not just a membership thing. If you have a strategic plan, which says the direction you're going, put it on your website if it's not already there, and talk about that regularly with your membership. Have your staff communicate that regularly if you have staff. Tell people about your values and what your goals are, and let them buy into your culture and let them support it. It will build a very strong organization. And I truly believe that. I worked with a club in Saskatchewan here earlier this year. And actually, sorry, it was last year. And they decided that they were going to develop a short strategic plan. And one of the things that they were going to do was to develop an all abilities program. And that was just such good things for their organization. It was wildly successful because they put a lot of effort and time into developing a solid program. And they changed the entire culture of their organization and how they approached everyone. And they became a lot stronger of a community because of it. So that started at the top and it filtered all the way down, and now it resonates up through the whole organization. It's important to communicate your direction. The third responsibility of the board of directors is relationship management. The board should aim to work in harmony and align its values and operations with its governing organizations. And Nicole spoke to this a bit earlier. She talked about the hierarchy that goes up to all the way to FIFA. So FIFA delivers its directives to Canada Soccer. Canada Soccer delivers its directives to the provincial and territorial sport association organizations. And then that comes down to the districts and then to the clubs. And it works a lot better if everyone is working together, coordinated, to deliver the work as a whole. A board should be compliant with its governing organization's bylaws, policies, and directives, and it should be a good partner with those governing organizations, but also its partners and sponsors, its members, and its competitors. I'm not saying you need to be best friends and share your trade secrets with your competitor organizations, but I do believe that you should have a healthy respect and be a worthy rival to them. These elements are also key components of Canada Soccer's club licensing program. So if you are on that path, you are likely already aware of this expectation. Boards must also minimize conflict of interest. So I mentioned this earlier, and it is very important. A conflict of interest occurs when someone has to make a decision in an official capacity, and they could stand to benefit personally from that decision. This conflict may be an actual conflict, such as two people who are in a domestic partnership that might be signing checks together. That is a definite conflict of interest. Or it may be perceived by others as a conflict of interest, or could be perceived as by others as a conflict of interest, such as if someone were to add their best friend to a committee without any due process or reviewing of other worthy candidates. This is also a criteria of the club licensing program, which says that boards must be comprised of individuals who do not hold a position of director, employee, or contractor simultaneously of another organization, as well as the one you sit on currently. So you must make every best effort to minimize and eliminate actual or perceived conflict of interest situations. And I think the perceived part is where we sometimes drop the ball. And that is just as important as an actual conflict of interest. Expectations of transparency are also increasing and continuously heightened. So it's a must to put mechanisms in place to manage conflicts of interest. Developing a policy or adopting BC Soccer's is an excellent start. Declaring conflicts of interest at the beginning of board meetings and removing yourself from the room, as in actually physically removing yourself from the discussion out of the room, is necessary. It's not enough to just withhold yourself from the conversation, but remain in the room. And you should also note this in the meeting minutes, so that if anyone ever came back to you and said, well, you do have this conflict and you were there, then you can say, actually, right here in the minutes, it says that I was removed from this situation. I had nothing to do with it, and it was taken care of. We did deal with this conflict. As well as developing a culture that openly discusses potential conflicts and others' potential conflicts, because they may not see it. It might be a forest through the trees situation. So just saying, hey, just wanted to check in on this. Are we all good to go? What about this situation? It's better to be safe than sorry. Next, boards must safeguard the assets of the organization. This most importantly includes financial oversight. Boards should ensure that their organization is in good financial health, has a realistic budget, and has established reserves to draw on if there are periods of financial hardship. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. After 20 months of the pandemic, I know that many sport organizations have been impacted negatively. And I think that there is some misnomer here, some misconception about profit or nonprofit and having a suitable reserve. So the difference here, and the Government of Canada and CRA have good requirements here. The difference between nonprofit and for-profit is that a nonprofit does not turn its resources back to its individual members. It's reinvested into the organization and generally works to operate to not necessarily achieve a profit. So maybe we're just breaking even. A for-profit organization on the others, and those profits go back to the ownership, or they go back to the members or stakeholders as who are part of that organization. So that is not to say, what I'm not saying is that nonprofits should not have money in the bank. That is not what I'm saying at all. In fact, I strongly believe that nonprofits should have a good reserve in their back pocket, invested or in savings, to maintain their operations in case another pandemic happens. Heaven help us if so, or funding falls through, or something unforeseen goes on. It is probably a strong idea to have a year's worth of, or 6 months worth of reserve in your in your back pocket just in case. And that can be beneficial in case someday you decide you're going to invest in a facility or something very big that requires a lot of funding. But the reserve, it should be there, and it's like an emergency fund. So I would say, please consider building it up if you don't have a strong one or one at all right now. As well, the board should regularly assess its risk in areas across its operations, such as governance, operations, finance, regulatory, and infrastructure. This also can include your, excuse me, the word is going to come to me, your reputation. The development and maintenance of a risk registry can assist in this. In many cases, organizations will use insurance to safeguard their assets, but there are other mechanisms such as policy and regular oversight which can help with this, or simply saying, here's what we're going to do if this were to ever happen. In the event of this emergency, here is our action plan. Having that in your back pocket can be extremely helpful. Lastly, it is the board's responsibility to ensure that your sporting environment is safe for all the participants in your organization. We must minimize maltreatment in sport, whether that's abuse, bullying, hazing, all those sorts of things. We must maintain and we must enhance safety. We must do more than the bare minimum, and we must go over and above and be proactive and not reactive. We can enhance safety in our sport through a variety of mechanisms, and there are several in the club licensing program that are available for you to use. So even if you aren't in that program, feel free to check that out and see what there is available. BC Soccer, I'm sure, would be thrilled to help you in this area or point you in the right direction at least. Canada Soccer has a safe sport page with a lot of resources, and Coaching Association of Canada, excuse me, and the Sport for Life Society also have several resources. There are lots of things available, and there are lots of skilled people out there who can support you to enhance your safety in your organization if you need support. So finally, I would like to close this webinar with a few final thoughts to share. Board leadership and governance is a continuous process. It is frankly a beast. It can be daunting, certainly. I joined the board that I sit on 2 years ago and was like, holy, what now? And I have worked with boards from the other side, from the staff capacity, supporting boards for over 5 years, more like 7. But when I joined a board, I was like, whoa, this is an entirely different experience. But we can start somewhere, we can start anywhere, and we can improve the governance and leadership in our organization by eating the elephant one bite at a time, just starting one small place and gaining some momentum there. There's always room to optimize and improve, and practices are evolving all the time. By continually reflecting on the governance and leadership of our organizations, we can head for optimization, in fact, of our board leadership and governance. And when we do this, this will mean greater efficiencies internally as well as externally. And I believe that our membership notices. When we operate well, our membership can pick that up. And when we are operating poorly, they definitely notice, and they also notice from the outside as well. And they may be deterred from our organization, our club, our sport entirely. They may go elsewhere as a result. So I think there's always a good place to start. It really depends on your organization. But you can work together and grow, and hopefully one day you'll look back on a time where it was not so great and you'll say, whew, can't believe we moved on from there. It's wonderful now. So those are my final thoughts on board leadership.